From the landing of Europeans in the Americas and into the days of the Mississippi Territory, laws were implemented that ensured the enslavement and continued oppression of Africans, indigenous Americans, and mulattoes. In 1820, legislation was adopted in Congress to maintain the balance between slave states and non-slave states. The 1833 Alabama Slave Code prohibited free people of color and slaves from becoming literate, and it limited travel, marriage, and employment. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act required that citizens assist in the return of escaped slaves to their owners. The 1852 updated Alabama Slave Code, restricting slaves to property on which they resided and worked, and disallowed ownership of firearms, dogs, and property, and forbid the gathering of 5 or more males. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that enslaved people were not citizens and therefore could not expect protection from the federal government or courts. In 1863, U.S. President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. In 1864, the Fugitive Slave Act was repealed, allowing for the free movement and travel of newly freed people of color. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. Alabama was the 25th state to ratify it. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 guaranteed equal protection under law for all citizens of the United States. The 14th Amendment prohibited states from denying equal protection of the law from any citizen. The 15th granted African American men the right to vote. However, Southern states would come up with new ways to keep them from voting. Enforcement acts in the 1870s gave the federal government substantial authority to prosecute those who violated the civil and political rights of African Americans, especially members of the Ku Klux Klan. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 guaranteed African Americans equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and prohibited their exclusion from jury service. This legislation would systematically break down over the next 20 years. In 1833, the Supreme Court declared parts of the 1875 Act unconstitutional, including the prohibition of discrimination in certain public spaces and transportation. This opened up the way for Plessy v. Ferguson, which stated separate was equal. In Giles v. Harris, the court concluded that unless it could actually supervise elections, it was unable to force white Alabamians to allow African Americans to vote. Bailey v. the State of Alabama invalidated a law that facilitated debt peonage, a form of involuntary servitude. Gwynn and Beale v. the United States deemed that state constitutional provisions permitting grandfather clauses for passing literacy tests as voting requirement were unconstitutional. Buchanan v. Worley deemed residential segregation unconstitutional. However, by the 1940s, Huntsville would be constructing neighborhoods based on racial segregation to house the different employees in the local defense production companies. In 1939, the Civil Liberties Unit of the Department of Justice was formed, making it the first federal entity tasked with the protection of civil rights since Reconstruction. Executive Order 882 prohibited racial discrimination in national defense industries. Defense production companies in Huntsville were loosely integrated. However, many housing projects for contract employees were segregated. Executive Orders 9980 and 9981 prohibited discrimination in civilian agencies, instituted fair employment practices, and abolished racial discrimination in the armed forces. Executive Order 10308 created the Committee on Government Compliance to enforce the prohibition against employment discrimination in firms contracting or subcontracting government orders. Brown versus the Board of Education held that public education and segregation of children in public schools, based solely on the basis of race, deprived equal education opportunities. The second Brown versus Board of Education stated that Southern schools should comply with all deliberate speed. This gave rise to equalization schools, which was a last-ditch effort to prove that Plessy versus Ferguson could work. The 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, made famous by Rosa Parks' demonstration, was a 13-month nonviolent protest by the black citizens of Montgomery to desegregate the city's public bus system. The Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 established the Civil Rights Commission and guaranteed qualified voters the right to register to vote in any state. In 1960, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Tuskegee city officials had redrawn the city boundaries unconstitutionally to ensure the election of white candidates. This was one of several cases that laid the foundation for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 1961 Freedom Rides were public bus trips undertaken by racially integrated groups through the Deep South to test the enforcement of newly enacting orders prohibiting segregation in interstate bus terminals. In 1962 in Huntsville, the Community Services Committee organized local civil rights activities, including fundraising and posting bail, education on nonviolent protests, sit-ins, prayer vigils, and logistics and political maneuvering. The 1963 Birmingham campaign was the climax of the modern civil rights movement. The city's violent response to the spring 1963 demonstrations forced federal government to intervene on behalf of race reform. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was a staging ground for activism and the civil rights movement. On Sunday, September 15th, the church was bombed, killing 4 children and injuring 23 others. The bombing was determined to be the act of 4 KKK affiliates. In that same year, Huntsville City Schools integrated. Veronica Pearson, Sonny Herford IV, David Pidgey, and John Bruton became the first black students to integrate Huntsville City Schools. Executive orders in the early 1960s continued to create ways to ban racial discrimination in the federal government. The 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, employment, schools, and federally funded programs. It also provided enhanced enforcement mechanisms to protect civil and voting rights. The fight for civil rights continued throughout the 1960s, including for legislation for voting rights, housing rights, and affirmative action programs. The fight continued in Huntsville as well. Do you recognize this Apollo 11 splashdown celebration photo? Behind Dr. Von Braun, you'll find something interesting. Behind him, you can see civil rights protests well into 1969. Signs read, "Black removal is Huntsville's perfected skill," and "Walks hazardous to poor blacks' health."